BC Racers, released in 1995 for the Sega 32X, also available on 3DO, MS-DOS, and Sega CD. And yes, that is the opening screen after the couple of logos you get prior. No proper title screen for this one, kids. Oops. So this is a bike racing game of sorts, set in prehistoric times where you get to pick one of 6 cave-dwelling bike riding vehicles and must race a bunch of tracks. BC Racers is actually a spin-off of a short-lived series of platformers called Chuck Rock, which comprised Chuck Rock and Chuck Rock 2 Son of Chuck. I'm only vaguely familiar with both games, never actually played them, but I've heard good things. So some of the options you have in this game feature settings for the number of laps you wish to race, minimum 4, maximum 8 I believe, a sound test, and difficulty settings for both the game and the AI of racers. The former basically being which set of 8 tracks you want to race in, and the latter focusing on the aggressiveness of the computer racers. Nothing in terms of button setup, not that it really matters. But anyway, the goal of BC Racer, much like any racing game for that matter, is to finish the race in as high of a position as possible, obviously aiming for first to win the championship races. There's also a combat element, as you can attack other racers and inflict some damage, as indicated by the dinosaur turning into a decaying skeleton thing. Damage is also done when you bump into things, but can be repaired when you consume some green drumsticks you can pick up between laps. Once you've sustained enough damage, your bike is wreck and you're out of the race, but you have 2 continues to try again. Though, would you really want to? That depends. BC Racers has a couple of issues, one of which involves control to a certain extent. The game only uses 3 buttons, which is perfect for the stock Genesis gamepad that only had 3 buttons. You have 1 button for acceleration, 1 for nitro, and 1 for executing a near useless attack, which serves more to impede your racing prowess than it does to improve it, hence why it goes largely ignored whenever I play this game. In fact, you could have easily replaced the useless attack button with a proper brake button, which doesn't exist because the stock gamepad on the Genesis only had 3 buttons, and 6-button gamepads didn't become a thing on the console until the Street Fighter days, even though this came out in 1995, and how many fighting games have we had at that point? But I digress. So instead, BC Racer has it so that by pressing down on the D-pad, you could use your handbrakes to sharpen your turns somewhat, similar to the old Atari 2600 game Enduro. Doesn't always work, however, and I end up crashing into things anyway. And since you take damage crashing into things or falling into hazards like deep water or lava pools, I feel the crashes are more of a danger than the other racers because again, attacks are near useless in this game since you seldom have opportunities to actually use it, and even when you do, the hit detection can be best described as charitably spotty. On top of that, you can only attack on the right side, which explains the sidecar on these things. They're your main attacker, but it really limits its uses. Road Rash, this is not. Braking and attacking issues aside, control isn't too bad. I mean, they're responsive enough and they do function, just not as smoothly as some of the more polished racers on the market at the time. And to BC Racers' credit, it is an infinitely more playable 32X racing game than the other one I played, Motocross Racing, which was far worse than this ever was. There's some clever bits here and there, such as being able to run over pedestrians and cause them to fly towards the screen. That's quite fun to do if you can actually pull it off. And the tracks themselves are quite nice and varied, with bridges and pits and stuff. Of course, there's 2-player split screen, which I haven't tried, and I can't imagine it working all that well, for a reason we'll get into later, but it's always fun for a lark. I do find the balance to be a bit out of whack. The first track, regardless of which difficulty you take, again, there's 4 of them, but there is always following a certain theme. The first track is always going to take place in your Stone Age town, but the second track is also going to take place at night, where you only have a dingy spotlight to light the way, and these night tracks are often the bane of any racing game, even when they're done well, and on a game like BC Racers with its issues, it's not a pleasant time. And each of the 4 difficulties, again, they follow the same sort of theme, which means every second track you race takes place at night, and it blows regardless of which difficulty you pick. Other than that, there's stuff I want to like about BC Racers, but then we come to the other problem I have with this game, and that is the choppy frame rate. Now, graphically speaking, BC Racers sports a rather pleasant cartoonish aesthetic that is somewhat compromised by the overall rough quality of the visuals, but there's some neat rotation effects on the player select screen, and the track themes are not too shabby looking. Again, you've got a bunch of these: a jungle level, desert level, volcanic level, and the dreaded night level, among others. And they would have looked fine if not for the somewhat choppy frame rate, which makes things difficult to tolerate and gives BC Racers that rough around the edges feels that makes it somewhat unpolished, for lack of a better term. Now, that said, sound is the only department where BC Racers truly shines. Sound effects aren't much to talk about. You have some nice revving of the engines here and there, but that's about it. Almost all the credit goes to the music, which has a bunch of laid-back, almost lounge music-esque tracks that I could understand some people writing off as bad or generic, but I don't know, I kind of like these. They're nice and soothing and laid back. They're not total garbage, which is the key thing here. I don't know, that's all I got really in this regard. Overall, BC Racers on the Sega 32X is below average racing fare at best, and a large part of that involves the choppy frame rate, questionable attacks, and some mild issues with control that makes the game a little more irritable than difficult. With that said, the game isn't entirely worthless, as there was some mild amusement to be had with this one. If you could stomach some of its quirks and maybe with a bit more polish, this would have been a perfectly satisfactory little racing game on the 32X. As is, BC Racers is not what I would call a good racer by any means, but nowhere near as wretched as some folks would have you believe. Your mileage, of course, may vary.